The shore at San Francisco Bay is calm. Families lean against the seawall, phones raised, watching a silver Boeing 737 line up with runway 28L. The sun is high, the air is clear, and the big jet looks steady, exactly how an arrival should look. But it isn't. From far away, it's hard to spot. Up close, it's obvious. The airplane is low. The nose lifts slightly, then settles. The engines sound quiet. Too quiet for this point in the approach. A few people on the beach glance at each other. Something feels off. Inside the cockpit, the flight deck is bright and busy. The runway fills the windshield. The precision lights off the left side. Piapi glow 3 red, 1 white, then 4 red. The jet is below the ideal path. Speed, the supervising captain asks. Coming back,
looks good.
the flying pilot answers, voice tight. He nudges the control column, raising the nose to hold the aim point. The tapes slide on the screens. Airspeed keeps bleeding away. The thrust levers sit at idle. Why isn't the power coming up? The captain says, more to himself than anyone. The habit from other airplanes is strong. Pitch for path. Auto throttle adds thrust. But the engines stay quiet. The auto throttle isn't waking up. Altitude ticks down. 500 feet. No room left for delay. Add power, the relief pilot urges. Silence. Just a second. But it's heavy. The runway numbers rush closer. Water flashes beneath the nose. Power, the supervising captain snaps. The flying pilot slams both thrust levers fully forward. The engine fans spool, slow at first, then faster, a rising howl that comes with a lag no one can shorten. Airspeed is still dropping. The nose comes up another degree. The jet pauses in the air, like a held breath. Outside, on the beach, someone lowers their phone. The tail looks too low. The seawall is too close. Inside the cockpit, go around. But the call comes with the ground now racing up. The engine still catching up, the airplane still sinking. Is it too late? Asiana Airlines Flight 214. Automation, fatigue, and seconds too late. It was a warm Saturday afternoon in the summer of 2013 when Asiana Airlines Flight 214 prepared for departure from Seoul's Incheon International Airport. A 10-hour flight across the Pacific, routine, uneventful, the kind pilots and passengers take for granted. Inside the terminal, 291 passengers lined up to board the Boeing 737-200ER, one of the most reliable, safest aircraft in the world. Among them were 77 South Koreans, 141 Chinese travelers, and 61 Americans, along with a few passengers from Canada, Japan, and Vietnam. 70 of them, students and teachers, were headed for a summer camp in California, chatting excitedly about San Francisco and Disneyland. Flight attendants moved calmly down the aisles, smiling, guiding passengers to their seats. 12 crew members in total, all trained, all confident. They had done this 1,000 times before. The aircraft itself gleamed on the apron. A Boeing 777, powered by 2 massive Pratt & Whitney engines, capable of crossing oceans with ease. Since its introduction, the 737 had never suffered a single fatal passenger accident. For Asiana Airlines, it was a symbol of trust and modernity. The call sign was OZ2 scheduled to leave at 5 p.m. local time, flying east into the night, crossing the Pacific, and landing in San Francisco just before noon the next day. But this wasn't just a normal crew rotation. Today, 2 captains sat in the front seats, one flying, one supervising. In the left seat was Captain Lee Kang-kook, 45 years old, an experienced pilot with nearly 10,000 total hours of flight time, but new to the Boeing 737. He was in the middle of transition training from the Airbus A320, a smaller jet with different systems and automation logic. Beside him sat Captain Lee Jong-min, 49 years old, a senior training captain acting as instructor for the flight. Behind them, 2 relief pilots, a relief captain and first officer, would handle cruise duties while the main crew rested. Before pushback, the checklists rolled out smoothly. Fuel load verified, passengers seated, cargo secure. Outside, the orange glow of dusk lit up the tail fin as the 777 began pushback from Gate 24. The engines roared to life, deep, confident, steady. No alarms, no warnings. Just the familiar rhythm of a long-haul journey beginning. At that moment, not one of the 307 people aboard could imagine that by the time this flight reached San Francisco, they would be seconds from disaster. And the world would once again question just how safe automation really is. In command of Flight 214 was Captain Lee Jong-min, age 49, a calm, respected instructor with more than 12,000 flight hours, over 3,000 of them on the Boeing 777. Beside him sat Captain Lee Kang-kook, 45 years old, an experienced airline pilot with nearly 10,000 total hours, but just 43 hours on the 777. He wasn't a rookie pilot, he was a captain in training, transitioning from the Airbus A320 to the 777, a far larger and far more complex machine. This flight would serve as part of his final line training before being certified as a 777 captain. That meant Captain Lee Jong-min wasn't just supervising, he was evaluating. Every checklist, every radio call, every maneuver mattered. Behind them, 2 more pilots, the relief captain and relief first officer, would take control during the long ocean crossing, allowing the primary crew to rest before the approach into San Francisco. On paper, the system was perfect. 4 highly trained pilots sharing 1 flight. But in reality, the setup came with hidden risks, hierarchy, pressure, fatigue, and communication barriers that could quietly erode safety. For one, both lead pilots were Korean speakers, trained under an airline culture that valued politeness and seniority. Questioning a senior, even subtly, wasn't easy. In aviation, that hesitation can be deadly. Then there was the body clock factor. By the time they began their approach into San Francisco, it would be 3 a.m. Korea time, the lowest point of alertness in the human circadian rhythm. Even well-rested crews perform worse during that window. Reaction time slows, decision quality drops, and mistakes compound. Before departure, the training captain reviewed the arrival plan. San Francisco's runway 28 left. Visual approach, clear skies expected. But there was one key complication. The glide slope, part of the instrument landing system, was out of service due to runway maintenance. That meant the crew would fly a visual approach, manually managing their descent angle while using the localizer to stay aligned horizontally with the runway. For a pilot accustomed to full automation, this was a serious challenge. The airline's training system emphasized automation use over manual control, and many pilots went months without hand-flying an approach. Asiana's philosophy was simple: minimize manual inputs, rely on computers. But today, that philosophy would leave Captain Kang-kook exposed. This would be his first ever visual approach in a Boeing 777 without glide slope guidance. He was confident in procedure, but uncertain in muscle memory. Still, under the watch of his instructor, he kept his voice calm, his hands steady, and his doubts quiet. The plan was simple: follow the localizer, use visual cues for descent, and land smoothly on 28L. But as the 777 crossed the Pacific through the night, the seeds of confusion were already planted, hidden not in the weather or the aircraft, but in the pilots' minds. By the early hours over the Pacific, Flight 214 had settled into its rhythm. The cabin lights dimmed, passengers slept, The engines hummed steadily in the dark, echoing through the fuselage like a heartbeat. In the cockpit, the relief crew took over as planned. The training captain and his trainee retreated to the business class rest seats. They would have nearly 5 hours to sleep before returning for the landing. The flight was smooth, uneventful. The kind of crossing that gives crews confidence in the machine. And the Boeing 777 rewarded that confidence. Its automation was advanced, dependable, and to many, nearly flawless. But that dependability came with a hidden cost. Over time, pilots had learned to trust the system. Too much. Automation complacency had quietly replaced manual skill. At Asiana Airlines, this shift had been cultural. The company's procedures strongly emphasized using autopilot and auto-throttle from takeoff to touchdown whenever possible. Manual flying was seen as unnecessary, even risky. Instructors often told trainees that the safest pilot was the one who lets the airplane fly itself. This philosophy made perfect sense on paper. Automation reduces human error, stabilizes flight paths, and cuts fatigue. But it also means that when something breaks, or when the system behaves unexpectedly, the pilot's instincts aren't as sharp. For Captain Lee Kang-kook, the pilot flying today, this was a real concern. He had spent 6 years on the Airbus A320, a jet with a completely different philosophy. On the Airbus, the computer guards the flight envelope. It prevents pilots from overstressing the aircraft. On the Boeing, however, pilots have far more control and far more responsibility. The auto-throttle system in the 777 in particular was more subtle. It could enter different modes: speed, flight level change, or hold. Each mode determined how the engines responded to airspeed and pitch. Understanding the difference was essential and easy to get wrong. Captain Lee had studied these modes in ground school, but he had never been tested on them under pressure. And tonight, the perfect storm of fatigue, unfamiliarity, and company culture would push that knowledge to its limit. At 2:30 a.m., Korean time, both main pilots returned to the cockpit, still adjusting to the harsh glow of the instrument panels. Outside, the horizon glowed faintly ahead, dawn breaking over the Pacific. The relief crew stepped aside. The training captain settled back into the right seat. The trainee, calm but tense, slid into the left. They reviewed the approach checklist again. Visual approach, glide slope inoperative, clear weather. Everything appeared manageable. But inside the cockpit of this 300-ton aircraft, there were already two conflicting expectations. One, that automation would do its job perfectly. And two, that the pilots could take control instantly if it didn't. In just a few hours, those expectations would collide, literally, at the edge of the San Francisco Bay. At 10:45 a.m., San Francisco time, Asiana Airlines Flight 213 crossed the California coast. For the passengers, the long journey from Seoul was nearly over. Below, the Golden Gate shimmered in haze. The Pacific glowed blue and endless. For the crew, though, this was where the real work began. Inside the cockpit, Captain Lee Kang-kook and Training Captain Lee Jong-min rechecked their approach plan. San Francisco's runway 28L would be the landing runway. Clear skies, no turbulence, visibility perfect. But one key piece of equipment was still out: the glide slope transmitter. Normally, the glide slope gives precise vertical guidance all the way to touchdown, a beam that tells the airplane if it's too high or too low. Without it, the crew had to rely on visual cues and manual descent management. For most seasoned 777 pilots, that was no issue. For a pilot still learning the aircraft, one trained on full automation, it was unnerving. Still, procedure demanded confidence. Visual approach, runway 28 left. The controller cleared. Runway 28 left, cleared visual. Captain Kang-Cook read back. His voice sounded steady, but his mind was racing. Yao Kir had never flown a visual-only approach in the Boeing 757 before. Not once. In the Airbus A320, he could rely on automated pitch and power protections. The airplane would not let him stall. The Boeing, however, would. The descent started from 14,000 feet, about 20 miles from the runway. The goal, slow from 210 knots to 137 knots. The target landing speed, while maintaining a 3 degrees glide path. But that meant doing mental math that automation had long replaced. For every 1,000 feet, the airplane should be roughly 3 nautical miles from touchdown. For a standard descent, the rate should be around 700 to 800 feet per minute. Captain Kang-Cook knew the numbers, but didn't instinctively feel them yet. As the aircraft descended, the auto throttle managed thrust automatically, keeping speed stable. But the moment he changed the flight mode, switching from flight level change to vertical speed, something subtle shifted. The throttles pulled back to idle. He didn't notice. Neither did the instructor. Instead, the crew focused on aligning the aircraft laterally using the localizer. The runway looked good through the windshield, slightly hazy, far ahead. They were above the ideal glide path, but descending smoothly. "Flaps 5, Kang-Cook called. "Flaps 5, the instructor confirmed. But the airspeed stayed high, and the aircraft's nose began to pitch up slightly as the autopilot tried to slow it. This brought the 777 even higher above the glide slope. "Gear down," Kang-Cook ordered. "Gear down," the instructor said, watching as the landing gear lever dropped. Wind noise filled the cockpit almost. Now, with drag increased, the descent rate deepened, 1,000 feet per minute. But the speed still refused to settle at the selected 180 knots. The instructor frowned. "We're fast." "I know," the trainee replied. He twisted the speed knob again, dialing lower, expecting the auto throttle to respond. It didn't. The levers sat motionless, quietly idle. Neither of them realized that the airplane's power system had gone into hold mode, silently handing over control of thrust back to the pilots. They assumed automation still had it. The Boeing 777 was now descending, high, fast, and quietly running out of lift energy, with 2 pilots who didn't yet know the engines were asleep. At 1,500 feet, the giant Boeing was still above the ideal glide path, nose high and losing time to correct. From the cabin, nothing looked wrong. The bay shimmered below. Passengers leaned toward their windows, excited for landing. But in the cockpit, the mood was shifting. "Speed check," the instructor said. "Speed, 175, replied Captain Kang-Cook. He was fighting 2 things at once, getting down on profile and slowing the airplane. "Flaps 20, he called. The flaps extended, adding drag. The nose dipped. The aircraft began to descend faster, 200 feet per minute. First, this helped. The runway angle began to align visually. But the speed still hovered above target, stubborn and steady. "Still too fast," said the instructor. "Roger," Kang-Cook answered, trying to sound calm. He lowered the landing gear, the massive wheels unfolded, the thud reverberating through the fuselage. Wind rushed louder outside. The aircraft slowed slightly, but not enough. They were 5 miles from touchdown, still high, still fast. The instructor, now uneasy, glanced outside. 4 white lights on the left of the runway approach, the Popeye system. That meant one thing: too high. "Let's increase descent," he said. Kook nodded and dialed a steeper vertical speed, 1,500 feet per minute. The airplane's nose dropped. Passengers felt a slight heaviness in their stomachs. The speed came down a little more. But now, the rate of descent was excessive. "Sink rate," called the relief first officer from behind. The warning tone echoed through the cockpit. The instructor ignored it for now. As the jet passed through 1,000 feet, the crew should have stabilized. Correct speed, descent rate, flaps, gear. That's the golden rule. Stable by 1,000 hours or go around. But this approach was anything but stable. The descent was steep, the speed inconsistent, and the thrust levers, still at idle, remained untouched. At 800 feet, the instructor called, "Speed check, flaps 30. "Speed check," said Kook, pulling the flap lever. But they were still at 174 knots, too fast for full flaps. The instructor noticed, frowned, and said quietly, "Speed check. Flaps 30, sir." A polite correction, but not a warning. He was the senior pilot. The trainee was still being tested. Nobody wanted to sound alarmed. At 700 feet, they were still high, still fast. The runway looked closer now. The bridge in the distance, the bay waters shimmering like glass. "Sink rate," the automated voice repeated. They ignored it again. Kook now switched the mode to flight level change, believing it would adjust both pitch and thrust automatically. But that change silently set a climb altitude, 3,000 feet. And the autopilot briefly began pitching up. He reacted quickly, disconnecting it. To prevent the nose from rising, he pulled the throttles back even further to idle. That tiny motion sealed their fate. Now, the auto throttle entered hold mode. Thrust motors disconnected, no longer managing power. From this moment on, the engines would stay at idle unless someone manually pushed the levers forward. Neither pilot realized it. They thought the automation still had control. The 777, perfectly obedient, began to descend, quiet, heavy, stable, right toward the water. 800 feet. The runway stretched ahead, long, bright, perfect. But the Boeing 777 wasn't on the correct path anymore. Inside the cockpit, it felt calm. Too calm. There were no alarms, no flashing lights, just the rhythmic call-outs of altitude. 700. 600. Outside, everything looked normal. The sea glimmered, the air was clear, and the jet was gently descending toward San Francisco's runway 28L. But inside the instruments, disaster was quietly forming. The auto throttle, disconnected and idling, was no longer maintaining speed. The aircraft's nose was high, but its speed was bleeding away. "Speed check," said the instructor. 150, replied Captain Kook. That was already 15 knots too slow. The instructor looked up. The 4 PayPal lights beside the runway glowed all red, meaning the jet was well below the proper glide path. But the instructor didn't react sharply. He was watching, evaluating, letting the trainee handle it. "Correcting," Kook said softly, easing back on the yoke to raise the nose, a natural instinct. On the Airbus A320, where he'd spent years flying, this would have prompted the engines to increase thrust automatically. On the Boeing 777, it didn't. The engines stayed quiet. The airspeed kept dropping, 145 knots, 140, 135. The airplane was now below glide path and on the edge of a stall. "Why is the power not coming up?" the instructor muttered. He leaned forward, scanning the instruments. The thrust levers still sat motionless. "Go around?" the relief pilot suggested from behind. No answer. Instead, the trainee tried again. raising the nose to pull the plane back onto the glide path. That maneuver only made things worse. As the nose pitched higher, the wings lost more lift. The plane sank faster. The ground warning began to sound. Sink rate, sink rate. Correcting, Kang Cook said again, his voice trembling slightly. Speed, the instructor demanded. 120, the trainee shouted back. Now, panic hit. The instructor finally reached for the throttles and slammed them forward. The twin engines roared, a deep thunder that shook the cabin. But jet engines don't respond instantly. They need seconds, long, eternal seconds, to spool from idle to full power. Outside, the beachgoers near the seawall saw it happen. The plane was too low, its tail dangerously close to the water. Someone shouted, "It's short!" Inside the cockpit, the radio altimeter called out, 50, 40, 30. Go around, the trainee yelled. The engine surged, finally power flooding back. But it was too late. At 106 knots, just below the safe stall margin, the tail struck the seawall at the end of the runway. A shattering impact. The rear fuselage broke apart instantly. The tail separated completely as the rest of the aircraft skidded forward, striking the runway and spinning violently to the left. Inside the cabin, passengers screamed as luggage tore free, oxygen masks dropped, and smoke filled the aisles. Seat rows twisted from their mounts. The plane's wings scraped the tarmac, one engine detached, and fire erupted beneath the left wing. Seconds later, silence. The jet had come to rest off the side of the runway, tilted, burning, its roof peeled open like torn metal. For a moment, the only sounds were wind, crackling fire, and the faint moans of the injured. Then, from the cabin, a flight attendant's voice broke through, calm, defiant, "Evacuate! Evacuate!" The moment Flight 214 came to rest, chaos and disbelief filled the air. Thick smoke drifted over the runway. Flames licked the fuselage. Inside, the cabin was dark, tilted, and filled with cries for help. Some passengers, dazed but alive, struggled to unbuckle their seatbelts. Others were thrown into the aisles by the violent impact. The tail section was gone, ripped clean off. Through the jagged hole at the back of the aircraft, sunlight streamed in, mingled with the rising black smoke. Despite their injuries, the flight attendants moved fast. One of them, badly burned but still conscious, unlatched the forward doors and deployed the slides. Another, trapped between seats, shouted directions to passengers. Within moments, 2 emergency exits were open, and survivors began sliding down to the tarmac. In the cockpit, the pilot sat in shock. The aircraft had stopped moving, but the reality hadn't caught up yet. "Evacuate," one of them asked. "Wait," another replied. They were still trying to contact the tower, unaware that the tail was gone and fire was spreading. Then, from the cabin, a male flight attendant shouted, "Fire! Fire! Evacuate!" Ignoring protocol, he picked up the PA and made the announcement himself, the one that saved dozens of lives. Fire crews arrived within 2 minutes. Flames were visible from miles away, curling up from the left side of the fuselage. Rescue trucks sprayed foam and water, while paramedics began treating passengers scattered across the grass and tarmac. Miraculously, most of them had survived. Out of 307 people on board, only 3 passengers lost their lives, 2 instantly from the impact, and a third later in the hospital. But over 180 were injured, some critically. The wreckage scene was haunting. The tail lay near the seawall, shredded, unrecognizable. The main fuselage sat tilted on its belly, its roof peeled back. Inside, seats were twisted, overhead bins torn open, and personal belongings scattered everywhere. Within hours, investigators from the U.S. National Transportation Safety Board, NTSB, arrived. Their mission: to find out why a perfectly good airplane on a clear day had crashed short of the runway. They began by pulling data from the flight data recorder and cockpit voice recorder. The numbers told a chilling story. The auto throttle had been disengaged for over 3 minutes before impact. The engines had stayed at idle all the way down. The pilots, believing the system was still active, never noticed. The voice recorder revealed the growing confusion in the cockpit. The trainee pilot questioning the controls, the instructor hesitating, the late power call, and finally, the desperate go-around. Just seconds before impact, the NTSB ruled out mechanical failure. The Boeing 707 performed exactly as designed. Instead, they identified a lethal mix of automation misunderstanding, fatigue, and training culture. Asiana Airlines, they found, had emphasized automation over manual flying skills. Pilots were trained to rely on computers, not intuition. The captain flying that day had never practiced a visual approach in the 777 without glide slope assistance. The investigators also noted the airline's cultural structure. A cockpit environment where deference to authority often discouraged challenge. In this case, the trainee didn't question the instructor soon enough, and the instructor didn't intervene fast enough. The report concluded, the probable cause was the flight crew's mismanagement of the airplane's descent, their inadequate monitoring of airspeed, and the delayed go-around decision. In simpler terms, the plane crashed because no one realized it was too slow, too low, and too late. In the days after the crash, the wreckage of Asiana Flight 214 became a silent classroom. Every wire, every gauge, every fragment of aluminum told part of the story. A story that would redefine how pilots, airlines, and manufacturers understood automation. On the surface, the crash seemed unbelievable. Clear skies, a modern aircraft, an experienced crew. Yet it happened, not because of a single failure, but a chain of small human oversights, magnified by technology that worked too well. When the NTSB released its final report, the verdict was clear. There was no mechanical fault in the Boeing 777. The engines, instruments, and autopilot all performed as designed. The tragedy stemmed from human misunderstanding. The pilots believed the autothrottle was active when it wasn't. The aircraft's automation had quietly handed control back to them, but neither noticed. Investigators highlighted a deep issue, one that stretched beyond Asiana Airlines. Modern cockpits had become too quiet, too automated, and too trusting. Pilots had become managers of computers rather than masters of flight. The NTSB made several major recommendations. Boeing should improve training on auto-throttle modes and clarify when the system disengages. Asiana Airlines must reinforce manual flying skills, not just procedures. All airlines should emphasize the importance of callouts, clearly announcing every change in automation mode to avoid silent confusion. Boeing responded quickly, updating training materials and manuals for its aircraft. Asiana changed its simulator programs, requiring pilots to hand-fly more approaches and memorize the relationship between thrust, pitch, and descent rate. Fundamentals that had been fading in the age of glass cockpits. Globally, aviation authorities took note. The FAA and ICAO issued reminders. Automation should assist, not replace, a pilot's judgment. Meanwhile, survivors of Flight 214 carried memories that would last a lifetime. Some recalled the shock of impact, others the bravery of the crew who helped them escape the burning aircraft. A few even returned to flying, refusing to let fear define them. For the 3 young students who never made it home, memorials were placed near the runway's seawall. Every year since, flowers have appeared there. a quiet tribute at the edge of San Francisco Bay. Today, when a 777 glides down to land at San Francisco, its crew benefits from lessons learned that morning in 2013. Better training, stronger cross-checks, a deeper respect for the thin margin between trust and control. In the end, Asiana Flight 214 wasn't just a crash. It was a wake-up call, reminding the world that technology, no matter how advanced, is only as safe as the humans who command it. And in those final seconds above the water, it wasn't the airplane that failed. It was the silence in the cockpit. The quiet, fatal moment when everyone assumed the system was still flying the plane. The wreckage of Asiana Flight 214 was cleared from the runway within weeks, but the lessons it left behind would echo for years. In aviation, crashes are never just endings. They're investigations, each one forcing the industry to evolve. San Francisco International reopened runway 28L under new procedures. Boeing updated its auto throttle and pilot training manuals, and Asiana introduced mandatory manual flight sessions in simulators. Every new captain was now required to perform visual landings, no automation, to rebuild instincts once dulled by over-reliance on technology. But the bigger change wasn't technical. It was cultural. Inside cockpits around the world, flight instructors began teaching what Asiana 214 had exposed so painfully. Automation isn't a crutch, it's a tool. And tools fail when we forget how to use our hands. The story also reignited a long-standing conversation. How cockpit hierarchy and politeness can blur decision-making. In South Korea, Japan, and even Western airlines, training began focusing more on crew resource management, CRM, open communication, assertiveness, and shared responsibility. Because in those last moments over the bay, the truth was simple. Someone needed to speak louder. In the years since, the Boeing 777 has continued to fly millions safely. The model remains one of the most reliable aircraft ever built. But to every pilot trained after 2013, the number 214 still carries weight. A reminder that the line between routine and disaster is measured in seconds and silence. For the passengers who survived, that day became a dividing line in their lives. They would later describe moments of kindness among strangers. A hand reaching out, a slide catching fire, a cabin crew member crawling back into the wreckage to pull others free. Those moments, not the crash itself, became the real legacy of Flight 214. Discipline, humanity, and second chances. Every time a 777 descends over the same waters toward runway 28L, the pilots glance at their instruments, cross-check the power levers, and say the words the Asiana crew never did in time. Stable. Continue. The flight lands. The engines roar to idle. The wheels kiss the runway. The silence that follows isn't fear. It's respect. Respect for those who didn't make it home, and for the fragile partnership between man and machine that keeps the skies safe. This is the story of Asiana Airlines Flight 214, and how one misunderstanding reminded the world that the most advanced airplane ever built still depends on the oldest skill in aviation: awareness.